Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm really excited about today's topic, and that is about how to make pumpkin powder, why you might want to make it, and its many uses. So I'm going to get started on this topic. So first, let's talk about why you might want to consider taking either your own homegrown pumpkins or pumpkins you've collected from other people and started to preserve them, why you might want to choose to dehydrate them over freezing or canning. This is my first year actually dehydrating pumpkin. I've been planning on doing it for years, but I always end up just freezing it up instead of dehydrating. But this year I decided it was time to finally crack down and try this because I want to clear out more space in my freezer, as well as seeing what kind of options I have using the pumpkin powder and having fun just experimenting with it. So that right there is one reason why you may want to do that, is that it will save all kinds of space. Now in the earlier This and That video, I said that the ratio would reduce it down to about 1/5 the size it was. Well, I found out it's actually a lot less than that. So here's an example. This is a pint-sized jar that is not yet filled. I still have more pumpkin on the dehydrator right now that's going to top this off. And by the time I get to the last 3 pumpkins I have here, I might even have to start another jar. But what this represents right here alone is about 14 cups of pumpkin right there. 14 cups of pureed pumpkin. So I would say by the time I fill this jar up, I'm going to have a minimum of 16 cups of pumpkin in here. That tells me about 1 ounce of pumpkin powder by volume, not by weight, is going to equal about a cup of rehydrated pureed pumpkin. But the beauty about using dehydrated pumpkin is you can make it as strong as you want. You don't have to water it down that much. And that is one of the great things about this, is that you can add a lot more flavor of the pumpkin to the various things you're making by doing it this way. And it does rehydrate up beautifully, or reconstitute, however you want to word it, and it will have the same texture as it was before you dehydrated it. So let's say you already had it in a puree form, you dehydrated it, then you reconstituted it, maybe even cooked it a little bit. That's not always necessary though to cook it. Then you'll end up with a nice pumpkin puree. So not only are you saving your shelf space by not canning it, just by my guess so far, based on what I've done so far, this 1 jar can represent 8 pint jars of pureed pumpkin. So now we've taken up 1/8 of the space by doing it this way. And now you have more room for other jars of other things in your pantry. Or if you're one like me that's always like to freeze the pumpkin, now you have more freezer space for other things. Or in the case of a grid down situation and you need to get all that stuff out of there, or you don't want to rely heavily on your freezer, there's another way you can put up your pumpkin that does not require a freezer or refrigeration. And then the other reasons are the many uses you can have for the pumpkin powder, the ease of use, and the fact that you can get so much more flavor out of it. So that applies to, like I have a little bit of spaghetti squash right here. I'm going to be doing that with the rest of my spaghetti squash. I have a bunch more in the other room. I tried doing just one, cooked some of it up. It was delicious. It intensified the flavor and it made it much sweeter. So I could see using spaghetti squash even in replacement of pumpkin in pies and more. And I would say that should apply to any squash, such as this orange butternut, the only one I got this year, a regular butternut, any kind of squash, acorn squash, you name it, whatever it is you grow. Dehydrating it seems to intensify as well as sweeten the flavor, which will make it very useful in many things. All right, so let's get to the how-to. Now again, this will apply to any squash, and this is just how I do it. Some people are going to have their own ways of doing this, so it's all going to be tailored to what works best for you. But what I like to do, I'll cut it in half, I'll scoop out all the seeds, which I then also like to toast on the wood stove. And I'll leave some of those little pumpkin pieces in there for flavor. And I just put them in a little cast iron skillet with some coconut oil and just toast them. And then I'll eat them whole, shell and all. They are so good. Put a little seasoned salt on there. They make a nice, tasty, and very healthy snack. And then the rest of the stringy stuff and some of the seeds I'll throw out to the chickens. And then I'll cut those halves up into smaller pieces depending on how big it is, just enough so I can fit it into a roasting pan like this, or a bigger roasting pan if you want. I do have a bigger one, but the thing I like about this is if I'm using my wood stove a lot, like I am this time of year, and this is where I do this, is on the wood stove, then this gives me more space on the wood stove. So I can just shove it to the back corner, let that bake. I always do, by the way, put a little bit of water in the pan. That will help prevent burning, as well as create steam that will cook that pumpkin faster. You can do this in your conventional oven. I would say cook it about, since I don't go by degrees because I'm usually using my wood stove and I rarely use a thermometer for that, I would say about 300 degrees, and then check it at a half an hour and see where it's at, and then check it again in another half an hour, just to give you an idea. I mean, I can't give you exact times on that because, like I said, I use my wood stove. The timing, the heat and the timing is going to be different. I just let it bake. I check it every half hour to see how it's coming along, and then once it's soft enough, it doesn't even have to be fully cooked. Once it's soft enough, I then just scoop it out of the shell. Now, you can, since you're going to powder, since you might be powdering it anyway, you can leave the shell on, especially if it's one that has a pretty thin skin on it. You can just leave that if you want. If you're going to powder it, it's not even going to be noticeable. But I just compost the skins when I do that. And then I like to use the silicone sheets. This is the one for my Kasori. I've got some for the Nesco. They also make these ones for the Excalibur, if you have that. And I just spread it on there. Now, what I found for this size, I think going only a cup per tray is best. You can fit 2 cups, but it takes way longer to dehydrate. I would say you're better off, to make it for ease of use, is doing 1 to 1.5 cups on a Kasori. On an Excalibur, you probably could go 2 cups, and probably a Nesco, because I think both of those hold more than these do. And I set my temperature at 115 degrees. I rarely ever go above 115 degrees. I'll go maybe 110 for herbs or less, but for everything else, 115 degrees. Now, for those who are probably wondering that you know I have a wood stove dehydrator. Why am I not doing this on my wood stove dehydrator? Well, because of the silicone, I don't want the silicone to get really hot. And because of the length of time it takes to dry the pulp from the squash, to dry it next to the wood stove would take too long. I would be concerned about it possibly spoiling in the time it would take to dehydrate it there. But on top of the wood stove, it can get a little bit too hot, and I don't want to do that on the silicone. I don't like my silicone to get too hot. I get concerned about it getting too hot and then causing some toxins to get into the food. So in this case, I am relying on the electric dehydrator for this particular thing. And I'm really liking the cabinet style. I'm finding I'm really liking it. I like the fact that I can just open and close that Kasori door real easy. I don't have to hassle with a door that you have to take completely off and put on. But anyway, so I just spread that on there. So for this, I would say 1.5 cups most per tray. 2 cups I found was just a bit too much. It does dry, it just takes too long. And then let it dry for about 10 to 12 hours. You're putting at least 2 cups on something like this, or maybe 3 cups on an Excalibur tray. You might need a full 24 hours at 115 degrees. Now, if you want to turn it up higher, that's going to be up to you. This is just my personal preference. And then once it gets to the point, you'll find there's this point where it's like fruit leather, and it's very, very leathery. If you can't crack it though, you need to put it back in the dehydrator and give it time to where it will still feel a little bit leathery when you lift it off there. But if you can at least crack it, crunch it with your hands like that, that will then be dry enough to powder. Now, you can leave it in flake form if you like, but for ease of use, for the many things you're going to want to use it in, I do recommend in this case powdering it. So and what I did, and you can see my blender here because I'm in the process of powdering up a bunch still. I'm just using my blender for this. I put at least a whole tray in at a time. I've been using the tamper that Patrick made me to kind of crunch it down in there to make it blend up a little easier. And then just powder it up. And then if you're going to put this in storage, you're not going to use it every day, I do recommend with the pumpkin powder to go ahead and vacuum seal it, because this is going to be one that will harden in there, like maybe not as badly as tomato powder will, but enough that you're going to really want to make sure you have a good tight fitting lid, and it would be best if you're going to vacuum seal, especially if you're planning on setting it back there for long term. So let's say you did do several jars like this, then go ahead and vacuum seal it. You can leave one out if you plan on using it daily. If you're not going to use it every day or even at least once a week, then I do recommend vacuum sealing between each use, or at least make sure that, like in this, I have this kind of lid on here. It's got a little silicone ring on there. Make sure you get that lid on really snug because you want that airtight. This isn't so bad because the jar is pretty full, but once your jar gets about half full and you're still working through it, then I recommend putting it in a smaller jar so that you don't have to vacuum seal every time, and then you're reducing the amount of airspace that's in there, because it's that airspace that's going to cause the stuff in there to harden and clump up. And anyway, so it's actually super easy to do, and like I said, you can take all of this and just make it take up far less space by doing this. Now, one question I want to answer real quick, because I had somebody ask me one time, well, why would anybody want to take winter squash that can last all winter long in storage as long as you keep it in a cool area? Why would you want to dehydrate it or preserve it in any other way, since it will stay preserved just as is and you can pull them out as you need them? Well, for me, even though we have areas we can keep it cool enough, it's space that is the issue. And I don't mind keeping these things out on the counter in the other room and stuff to get us through Thanksgiving, because it makes lovely decor. But there comes a point where it's like, I need my space back. I need to get all this stuff taken care of. So it's out of here and I've got it put away. And then other people, you got to understand, there's people too that live in warmer climates that stay warm year round. They might not have root cellars or any place in their home where they can keep the squash cool enough that it's not going to rot on them, because it will still spoil if it's not given a cool enough place to keep. So anyway, it's all just going to be up to you. I mean, if you have plenty of root cellar space, then just go ahead and do it that way. But I am so thrilled with the pumpkin powder that I did finally go back and pull all the pumpkin out of my freezer. That's mostly what you're seeing in this jar right here, and started dehydrating it up. I had some that went clear back to 2015, and here's one of the things I'm realizing is that by having it in this form, I'm going to be working through it a lot more and using it up more and using it in more things, because it's a lot easier. It's handy. I don't have to remember to, oh yeah, go pull a jar out of the freezer and let it thaw out, or if I had it canned, go open up a jar that maybe I only need a couple spoonfuls out of. So by having it powdered, I'm just going to make a lot more use of it. All right, now let's talk about its many uses, and this is where it gets really exciting. So I've done a few things so far. Even though I only just started dehydrating the pumpkin, right away I started using it in things. So the very first thing I did was made some pumpkin spice oatmeal. I got the idea from our good friend. She has some pumpkin. She'll open up a jar and put some in the oatmeal and add some spices to it. And I'm like, well, why can't you do the same thing with pumpkin powder? So that was my first experiment. Put in about a tablespoon or two of pumpkin powder into a pot of oatmeal, threw in a pinch of cloves, a pinch of nutmeg, and some cinnamon, and added some maple syrup right to that. And boy, that turned out really tasty. And my grandson was here that day and I shared some with him and he loved it. He couldn't seem to get enough of it. And then the next day I made pumpkin pancakes. Now the cool thing about the pumpkin pancakes was not only did I use the pumpkin powder in it, everything but the water, of course, that I used in making the batter was all some kind of powder, some kind of dried product. So I used my home milled whole wheat flour. I used the organic whole milk powder. I used the pumpkin powder, which of course is organic, homegrown. I used my own chicken eggs that I had dehydrated, and I believe I used butter powder in that. I just added the water and then mixed it up. Oh, and yes, I also put some spices in. I did the nutmeg, the cinnamon, and the cloves in there as well. And those were really delicious pancakes, by the way. And then I put a little bit of maple syrup into the batter itself, as well as the maple syrup on top. Then the other thing I did, just whipped up a little tiny bit of it, again using just powders in this. I do have a recipe out there on how to make a pumpkin dip. In that particular one, it's an old video, I had some goat cheese I had made. So I used goat cheese in that. Normally I use cream cheese. So anyway, I just made a small amount. I didn't use a lot. I didn't really do any measurements. I wanted to just see how it tasted using both the pumpkin powder and the powdered cream cheese, and boy, it turned out good too. So I just put some cream cheese powder, some pumpkin powder, threw in my spices, threw in some maple syrup. Normally the recipe calls for brown sugar and maple syrup. I didn't use any brown sugar because of the powders. There was no need for that. I could put in more maple syrup and still get a really good consistency without it turning out too watery. And that was very, very tasty. It tasted very much like the pumpkin dip I make with fresh cream cheese. And then the other thing I tried just this morning, and I'm not one that really likes to drink sweet coffees much. I usually like my coffee just plain black, but I wanted to try it out of curiosity. I used the heavy cream powder and the pumpkin powder, and then some nice black coffee, add a little maple syrup for sweetness, and then threw in a few spices just like with the other things, and boy, that made a really delicious latte right there. That was so good. I had Patrick taste it. He's like me, he tends to like black coffee, and he really liked the taste of it too. So you can take that pumpkin powder and use it to flavor anything. Now, some other things I'll definitely be doing with the pumpkin powder, because now that I know for sure I can reconstitute it, end up with the same consistency but better flavor as a fresh pumpkin. I'll be using it in pie. I'll be using it in my homemade pumpkin cookies, which I also have a recipe for, a video recipe and a written recipe. And also in my homemade pumpkin bread, I do have a recipe on that. I don't think I have a written one. I don't think I do. I might, but I know I have a video recipe. I'll link to that down below. It's really old though. And also in making some homemade pumpkin creamsicles. I do that every so often. So I'm looking forward to trying that. Also using the heavy cream powder to see how well that works in there in making those. And then some other ideas that were coming to mind that I haven't tried yet is even using it just straight as a topping on ice cream or anything that you can think of, or even making an icing out of it. I've actually added, like with the pumpkin cookies, I've made a pumpkin icing to go on top, and using the pumpkin powder in that icing will be even easier than using the fresh pumpkin puree to get a good consistency and being able to manipulate it and get it exactly how I want it. You can use it for adding to soups. That might even be something in particular you might want to use your spaghetti squash and other squashes for. I think I have a recipe out there on butternut squash soup, but you could use the pumpkin powder or butternut squash powder or whatever squash powder you have to make that kind of soup. I love it. I don't make it very often because I'm really the only one that eats that one, but it's a nice soup. I've added apples to it from our own tree. And then I would think other types of cookies too. So if you just usually make like oatmeal cookies, consider trying to put a little bit of your pumpkin powder in with the oatmeal cookies. Usually you're adding a little cinnamon to them anyway. Maybe not everyone, but some people do. So that will add just even more flavor. Plus you're getting the nutritional benefits of these. You know, consider pumpkin is going to be high in your beta carotene, because just the color alone should tell you that. And then as I mentioned with the spaghetti squash, just add water. If you just want it as a side vegetable with whatever meal you're having, just add a little water, heat it up on your stove, and right there you've got some instant squash to serve, whether it be with butter and salt or a little butter and brown sugar, however it is you like to eat your squash. And right there, an instant side vegetable that was very quick to whip up. And again, hardly took up any room in your food storage. Well, I feel like I'm still forgetting some other things I meant to say, but that's okay, because I know a lot of you out there have some great ideas on how to use some pumpkin powder or any other squash powder in various things that you like to cook or make. And smoothies, I was going to mention that. I don't think I mentioned that, but to me that goes right along the same lines as the creamsicles, because basically the creamsicles are just a frozen smoothie. But anyway, go ahead and share with us your ideas, whether it be something you just thought of or something that you've already done. And even if you have some quick recipes you want to share down below, go ahead and do that so everybody can learn from you as well, and find a way to not only make some more space in our food storage, but to also just another great way to preserve some of our garden harvest. And don't forget to click on show more right down here below my channel name, or that little gray arrow right over here if you're on a smart device, to open up the description box and see any of the links I'll be putting down below. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.